Hi, everybody. It's Joe Firestone with the In-Depth program for New Macromedia. So, the interview that Bernie Sanders gave to John Harwood, KFC NBC, has caused people to focus in on the place in the interview where he says, I don't have to do that now. So I'm going to review the context, of that, and then I'm going to explain why I don't think he really has to do that now. Hi to everybody, by the way. Hi, Dolores. How are you? Hi, Sharon Anthony Connors and Margot Shepard and Dale Weaver. Hi to you all. Thanks for tuning in promptly. I'm glad you're here. The weather here west of the D.C. area is a little wild right now. By wild, I mean dark and stormy, and tornado warnings. So it's possible that I'll be dropping off here rather quickly, but so far it's not having any effect, on us. I don't know whether it's having any effect on how I can be seen, and heard. But we'll see. Anyway, I want to get into my presentation now. Hi, Lana and Brian Gary. Nice to see you. So nice to see everybody. I'm going to share the screen with my presentation here so you can see what I'm doing. I guess for some reason you're not able to see it, but I will fix that for you in just a minute. Here we go. Now you should be able to see me in the upper left-hand corner. Hi. And also see my presentation here, which I'm going to go through now fairly quickly, I hope. So it's entitled that Bernie's right. He doesn't have to tell you how he will pay for it. So what is he paying for? Well, Medicare for all, of course. During the recent CNBC interview of Bernie Sanders by Harwood, John Harwood, the following dialogue occurred. John Harwood said, quote, one of the constraints has been fiscal. Senator Warren is producing plans to pay for Medicare for all. You've identified revenue sources for about half of it. Do you think it's important to identify revenue sources for the other half? Question mark. Or do you believe, as those who subscribe to modern monetary theory believe, that we've been a little bit too constrained by concerns about the deficit? And Bernie says, we've been trying to pay for the damn thing. At a time of massive income and wealth inequality, it is my view that the wealthiest people in this country, the top 0.1%, should be paying substantially more than they are paying right now. You have an insane situation. Let my Wall Street friends there tell me why it makes sense. Then, for purposes of this analysis, I deleted just a little bit, which is indicated by the ellipse. I deleted the fooling around in the interest, of brevity. And so then John Harwood asked, but you still have more revenue to go to make it fully paid for, yes? Question mark. And Bernie then replies and says, the fight now is to get the American people to understand we're spending twice as much per capita, that of course we can pay for it. we're paying it now in a very reactionary, regressive way. I want to pay for it in a progressive way. Bernie goes on. You're asking me to come up with an exact detailed plan of how every American, how much you're going to pay more in taxes, how much I'm going to pay. I don't think I have to do that right now. And instead of Harwood asking directly, Bernie, why don't you think that you have to do that right now? I mean, that's the obvious question, right? And why do you feel that way, Bernie? He jumps to the gotcha question. You think it's foolish? Senator Warren is obviously trying to start a fight between Bernie and Senator Warren. And Bernie says, quote, I'm not saying it's foolish. All I'm saying is we have laid out a variety of options that are progressive. We'll have that debate. Note that well. We'll have that debate. At the end of the day, we will pay for every nickel of Medicare for All, and it will save the overwhelming majority of the American people who will no longer pay premiums. I think he meant to say that it will save money for the overwhelming majority of the American people who will no longer pay premiums. John Harwood then says, quote, would you envision that at the end of a Sanders administration, the deficit would not be larger than it is now? Unquote. And Bernie says, quote, under Trump, what we have seen is a huge increase in the deficits. I think I will do a lot better than Trump. Well, I know it seems to imply there he's saying that his deficits, are going to be lower, but he doesn't really say that. He just says, I think I will do a lot better than Trump. What exactly that means is open to interpretation, and I noticed that Harwood did not go for an interpretation, but anyway, Bernie continues, every major proposal that we have brought forth, whether it's Medicare for All, dealing with climate change, transforming our energy system, making public colleges and universities tuition-free, and eliminating all student debt in America, that's all paid for, unquote. Well, by the way, folks, from an MMT point of view, that is all paid for. The spending occurs first, after all, and then the taxing comes in. So, there's an awful lot of wealth out there that can make the policy space that's needed for the Federal Reserve to top up the federal spending account. But we'll get to that, in just a minute. Next, I asked the question, what does it mean to ask, quote, how will you pay for it? You, of course, is the government, which buys things in two different ways. First, when financial assets are involved, the Fed pays for them by creating reserves out of thin air in the act of spending for those assets. In other words, it buys financial assets from the banks and from other financial companies, as from AIG, for example. And it does this by creating reserves out of thin air in the act of spending for those assets. Actually, it creates the reserves out of thin air by marking up the relevant accounts in the private sector. And by getting the assets that it's trading them for. In other words, it buys the financial assets, gets title to them, marks up the accounts. Now, normally, we don't think of this as government spending. But if you think the Fed is part of the government, as I do, then it is government spending. Anyway, then the second way in which government spends is what we normally think of as government spending. When other goods and or services are involved, the Treasury pays for them mostly by using reserves in the Treasury spending account. Yes, sometimes the government may pay with coins for things. Sometimes it may pay with paper money. I, for example, have collected federal dollars when I used to have a computer business. I collected the prices for some of my goods, including computers, in cash. Some people in the federal government wanted to pay in cash rather than using checks and drawing on reserves in accounts. Okay, so when John Harwood asks Bernie that question, I guess I should finish this, by saying that's done some of the time, but the overwhelming majority of the time, 97, 98, 99% of the time, the Treasury is paying for goods and services using reserves in the Treasury spending account. So when Harwood asked Bernie that question, does he really want that kind of answer? Does he want Bernie to answer with the first answer about how the government pays for financial assets through the Fed, or the second, how the government pays for other goods and services by having the Treasury pay for them? Okay, so does John Harwood want that kind of obvious answer? Is that what he's driving at when he asks that question? I don't think so. I don't think he knows a sufficient amount about the money and how the government actually spends to know these two kinds of answers that Bernie could have given him. I think Bernie knows enough about it to give him those answers. But he doesn't really think that John is asking that. But maybe he should have clarified with John exactly what he was asking about to bring out what the truth is, what John Harwood was really asking about. Anyway, I'd like to interview John Harwood about that. But since I can't, I'll assume he's really asking Bernie, quote, how will you get new reserves into the Treasury spending account when it runs low so that you can spend congressional appropriations and not have debt ceiling crises, unquote. I think that's the question that Harwood really has in mind, because he's thinking about the situation where even when Congress has appropriated certain spending, that appropriation perhaps cannot lead to spending because there are things like debt limits and debt ceiling crises. Anyway, Bernie answered this implied question about how he would top up the Treasury spending account by saying he would tax the wealthy, but also that he had laid out 10 funding options when he introduced his bill. So a comment on that particular statement. Not that Bernie necessarily believes that taxes and bonds sold pay for anything. I presume that by now he knows better than that. But he also knows that they drain money. They drain money out of the private sector, and that when the Treasury drains money out of the private sector in that way, the Federal Reserve has to mark up the Treasury spending account with an equivalent amount of reserves that are being drained from the private sector. Okay, after Bernie had laid out the 10 funding options, when he says that, that's when he said, we'll have that debate. Okay? In other words, a debate about how the Treasury spending account can be topped up, and about what funding options will be used. I don't think his language here commits to using the 10 funding options that he laid out. I don't think his laying out the 10 funding options excludes the putting forward of other options at a later time when we're having that particular debate. But to continue the quote from Bernie, at the end of the day, we will pay for every nickel of Medicare for all, and it will save the overwhelming majority of the American people who will no longer pay premiums, unquote. So, here are the options for Medicare for all funding. I'm not going to read through them, but what I want you to notice by scanning them quickly is that these options are for funding through premiums paid by employers, through premiums paid by households, through taxes, through closing tax loopholes, which is also taxes, through imposing a fee on financial institutions, and through repealing corporate accounting gimmicks, which is also taxes. In other words, when people can't use the gimmicks, then they have to pay more taxes. So this is about, his options here are about premiums, new taxes, over and above the taxes that are being paid at this time, and imposing fees. Those are his 10 options. There are no other options except for those. But we know that he knows that there are other options to get the Fed to top up the Treasury spending account so it can spend appropriations. Does he have to mention those to John Harwood and open up the debate right now? Or is he better off saving it for when he is in office and is in a better position to educate the public about other ways, new ways of getting reserves into that spending account? His implicit answer in this is, later, when I'm in office and have time to make my case without campaign static. So now I pose the question again. Is he right? He is if the public is willing to go along with it in the face of media insistence that he has to do it now. Because, by the way, they're going to insist when they get through with Warren, forcing her to come forward with her plans to pay for it. They're then going to redouble these efforts to get Bernie to pay for it. Just yesterday, there was a headline from CNN that raised by this particular question that was discussed in one of the Jamarl Thomas clips, okay, from yesterday. He made much of the CNN headline and how that could be used, okay, in ads. So, make no mistake about this, they're going to harass Bernie. Certainly going to harass him about this. But what John Harwood says, and what others say, is that Bernie's options will only raise half the new revenue needed to pay for Medicare for all. So, let's now take a look at a Fiscal Times article on that issue and then come back to my presentation. Okay? And the Fiscal Times has this article. Oh, and by the way, I want to remind you, if you don't know, the Fiscal Times is the organ of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, the media center of faux fiscal responsibility in the D.C. area. And they publish articles, of course, that are almost always about fiscal responsibility. The headline of this one says, Sanders insists he'll pay for every nickel of Medicare for all, but he won't say how right now. And let me put this on clearly. Oh, this article is written by one of their main writers over there. His name is Yuval Rosenberg. And he is actually more objective than most any of their other writers. And I would say is more journalistic, okay, according to old standards. But there's still the bias that comes in. He did this on October 30th, 2019, which was yesterday. So now clearing out the extraneous material here. In a wide-ranging interview with CNN, John Harwood, and so on. Oops, sorry. That's not too long an article. Bernie said he doesn't think he needs to lay out a detailed plan to finance his Medicare for All proposal, but he insisted he will pay for every nickel of it and that an overwhelming majority of Americans would wind up saving money. And then they quote John Harwood, just as I just did. And they quote Bernie, and they say the things that I've just told you. So I'll scroll down now through this. And they say, when they get to talking about the options, okay, he released, okay, the list of options, they say the options, okay, or I should say Rosenberg says, quote, the options Sanders presented, including a wealth tax and higher income taxes for people who are making above $10 million a year, a 4% tax on families earning over $29,000, and a 7.5% tax on employers would only cover about half the cost of his health plan. Well, that's a little, all the options only cover about half the cost of his health plan, as Harwood said. Sanders hasn't made clear which options he would choose and how he would raise the trillions more he'd likely need to fully fund a transition to a government-run system. Now, is that true? Is that statement true? Was Harwood right? Is the Fiscal Times right? Is Rosenberg right? Moving on. On the budget deficit, Harwood also asked Sanders about how the deficit might or might not grow, if he becomes the president. And that's when Sanders said that every major proposal of his was all paid for. And then Rosenberg gets to why it matters. And he says, rival Democratic candidates and the media have been pressing Elizabeth Warren for more details on how she'd fund Medicare for all. Some have also offered faint praise for Sanders' honesty in acknowledging that middle-class taxes will have to go up. In that context, the Vermont senator's comments will open him up to fresh criticism. Just as Warren prepares to issue a more detailed financing plan. Quote, Sanders wants to sell Americans on something that covers everyone for everything but not explains how that is possible. The Washington Post's decidedly right-wing Jennifer Rubin writes, I put in the decidedly right-wing, quote, that frankly is no different than President Trump promising in 2016 that he had a fabulous health plan to replace the Affordable Care Act but was not going to share what it was, unquote. Yes, it is different, Jennifer Rubin. The reason why it's different is because President Trump has no idea what the hell he's doing, and Bernie has every idea what he's doing and has undoubtedly thought this through, and by the way, never consciously lies to the American people about anything, and they know that. They know that. He hasn't told them lies now for all the years that he's been in Congress. And he didn't tell them lies when he was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, either. That's why he was so popular. Bernie is probably the most honest politician out there. And I don't accept Tulsi Gabbard, from that evaluation. And the reason why I don't, by the way, one of the reasons, why I don't, is because she was out there today on Twitter supporting Obama when she knows very well Obama is a war criminal. She knows that better than anybody. She's constantly condemning the regime change wars. But here she was supporting Obama's comments, trying to damp down the enthusiasm of the progressives. Oh, you babies have to wake up that the world is a gray place, is an ambiguous place, that things are not black and white in the real world, that sometimes we have to make compromises. Like perhaps committing war crimes all over the planet? Compromises? Anyway. Makes me wonder whether Tulsi Gabbard is now making compromises. Why it matters. Part 2. It's also worth noting that given the opportunity to openly embrace MMT, a school of economic thought challenging some conventional notions concerning deficits and constraints to government spending, Sanders steered clear, as he has in the past, and insisted he'd pay for all his major policy proposals. And then there's a link to Harwood's interview. Okay. So, that's the kind of thing that's going to be said, and worse. That was relatively mild because it was from Rosenberg, and he basically was quoting other people who were being relatively polite, in this instance. But the Fiscal Times is going to hammer that again and again and again. But the question that we have to ask is, but is that true? Right now, governments at all levels pay for about 66% of national health spending of 3.8 T. There's no doubt about that. It was shown by Himmelstein, and Wohlhandler in research they did and published in 2016. And the pattern has continued since that time. It was about 65% then. It's about between 66 and 67.5% of national health spending right now. And that 3.8 T figure is the projection of CMS for 2019, which, in case you haven't noticed, we're done with the 2019 fiscal year already. So soon there should be the real figures. But usually these projections of CMS, are pretty accurate. And it's very likely that without changes in current law, that 3.8T is going to be right on the money. So, about 66% of that, between 66 and 67%, is about $2.5 trillion that our governments are spending right now. Now, my question is, does anyone really think that Medicare for All, which has worked in other nations in such a way that it covers everyone for from 1/2 to 2/3 of what we spend annually as a percent of GDP, will cost much more than that, okay, in other nations? In Canada, it costs 11%. Here, we're spending 18%, okay, of GDP. So the Canadian figure is is closer to 2/3, but it's not at that 2/3 figure. It's actually below the 2/3 figure. Now, if you take 2/3 of 3.8T, I mean, guess what? It's just about the same as 2.5T. In other words, we're spending enough right now to cover Medicare for All if we reached the efficiency of spending that they have in Canada, which is the nation that, other than size, is probably the most similar to the United States culturally in the whole wide world. Okay. But to move on, it is true that the transition period to Medicare for All may cost more than the average annual cost, okay, of Medicare for All if it weren't in the transition. But these additional costs will disappear over time, bringing Medicare for All costs into line with costs in nations such as Canada, for example. So that's a good reason to hold off. If Bernie holds off and he debates this following his election to the presidency, the outlines of the debate, okay, are going to be very different. But it should be made clear, and I'm going to make it clear right now, that if Bernie has identified $16 trillion over 10 years in policy space that he can get by doing premiums and taxation and fees, then that means that he's identified a total of 4.1T of space annually for Medicare for All. That would be the average, 4.1T of space annually. I say that because it comes from the 2.5T we're already spending now, and the 16T divided by 10, which is 1.6T per year. So 2.5T plus 1.6T is what? 4.1T of policy space annually for Medicare for All. So even if the transition years cost $600 billion more than the eventual costs that this program will settle into, Bernie has identified $1 trillion more than enough in options, creating policy space to handle likely spending on an annual basis for the transition. In other words, 1T more annually. Because if you add 600B to the 2.5T, you're coming up with 3.1T of spending for the transition period, but that's 1T short of the 4.1T of space that he's identified annually. So, let's go back and look at the options for just a moment. Because Bernie keeps saying that his Medicare for All program isn't going to have any premiums. So he's not really planning on premiums. But he's identified $1 trillion annually in excessive space over the 10 years. Well, guess what? His first two items, which are the premiums, only total $7.4 trillion over 10 years, or $740 billion a year. So, if he has $10 trillion of space over 10 years, or $1 trillion annually, then the truth is he doesn't expect to have to call on any premiums. It's just an option. He's saying, okay, it's an option. But he can go ahead with his claims that there won't be any premiums because that's certainly the way it looks. He has all these other options for the rest of the $16 trillion. So I wanted to make that clear to you in case you thought that Bernie was about to go back on his word that he wouldn't have any premiums in the Medicare for All bill. But let's go further. With the 1T annually in policy space, even assuming that the transition years would cost but $600 billion, we have to note that if Bernie doesn't, when he gets into the presidency, doesn't pass his own Senate bill, but rather the Jayapal bill in the House, then the transition period will only be 2 years and will cost that much less to manage than a 4-year transition bill. So let's now go to Jayapal's article and see what that's about. That appeared in the American Prospect, and it was written by David Dayen, otherwise known as D-Day in the blogosphere, when he was a lot younger than he is today, maybe 10 years ago. Anyway, Pramila Jayapal takes on Medicare for All's critics is the title of the article. And I'm going to go through this article as well for you. I wrote the damn bill, Bernie Sanders frequently says, but on Medicare for All, he's not the only one. There's also Pramila Jayapal, a second-term representative from Seattle, who's rapidly ascended as a progressive congressional leader, wrote the House version of single payer. She's the co-chair of the Progressive Caucus and has been touring the country to talk about it. She feels Medicare for All has been unfairly maligned during the presidential primary cycle. Of course, she's absolutely right. It is very frustrating to have your own party making the arguments of Republicans and insurance companies, unquote. Jayapal told the Prospect in an interview after a healthcare town hall in Los Angeles, quote, and they're not accurate in their representations, unquote. Jayapal's bill, H.R. 1384, has 119 co-sponsors in the House. I'm afraid it's only 118 now because Katie Hill resigned today. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to bear the drumbeat of the posting of constant nude pictures of herself on the web day after day after day. And she was chased out as a result. She wasn't able to take it anymore, and so she resigned. And getting back to the article, the bill was the subject of historic hearings in the Budget, Rules, and Ways and Means committees in the House. The first time Medicare for All has been formally debated in Congress. Yes, I remember those debates. Okay, and Adi Barkan in particular. And Jayapal said that Energy and Commerce, which is another committee with jurisdiction over health care, would hold hearings soon. But as Elizabeth Warren hunkers down to determine the financing for a national health care program, and as Joe Biden and Buttigieg attack the concept, the benefits of getting everyone in the nation covered have been pushed to the side. But for Jayapal, the debate comes down to two things: coverage and cost, but not government costs. Quote, "It is absolutely absurd to subject Medicare for All to a different standard of scrutiny instead of saying, wow, Medicare for All costs too much, how are you going to pay for it? The question to every candidate should be, quote, what is your plan to bring down healthcare costs over the next 10 years? And what is your plan to universally cover everybody? Because none of the other plans do that." She's so absolutely right about that, isn't she? None of the other plans say what they're going to do to bring down healthcare costs over 10 years and what they're going to do to cover everybody at the same time. None of them puts that forward, except for the Medicare for All single-payer plans. Dave says, H.R. 1384 takes direct aim at lowering healthcare costs, more than the Affordable Care Act or even Bernie Sanders' companion bill in the Senate, by setting a global budget for healthcare providers. In other words, each institution for healthcare providers gets a global budget, and they got to stay within that budget. Instead of Medicare paying individually for each service, the providers would get a set budget for the year to work within. Bonuses for employees, marketing expenses, and political donations would be strictly disallowed, and special funds for new equipment or managing an epidemic would be segregated. In other words, there'd be a special budget for those. Hospitals would have to manage costs better, perhaps by reducing readmissions, also by eliminating unnecessary treatments, purchasing supplies more cheaply, or maybe even cutting salaries for administrators. Rare among politicians, Jayapal has been willing to cite the industry's role in unsustainable price increases. But she has also attempted to drive a wedge within the wall of opposition to healthcare reform among hospital industry leaders. Quote, I've been meeting with a number of major hospital CEOs in community-based care and state hospital systems. Unquote, she says. Quote again, they're getting upset with the American Hospital Association's opposition and the money they're putting in. So I'm working to try to build a little coalition that will feel brave enough to come out, unquote. Some hospital CEOs have cited the high cost of securing care for their own employees as a reason to transform the system. The U.S. pays more for health care than any other industrialized nation, which is why a mechanism like global budgeting is so critical. Yet the only costs being discussed in the national debate involve the taxes to pay for the government's assumption of insurance. Overlooked in that discussion is the fact that the federal and state governments already pay for 2/3 of the system through Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance subsidies. So there you have it. Jayapal is aware of that 2/3 figure that governments are already covering. The rest is covered by private insurance and out of pocket for the rest of the private sector. But all of it is really funded by the private sector because none of it is funded through deficit spending. So all of it gets funded through the private sector. Maybe I shouldn't say funded, but an equivalent amount of private sector money is taken out of the private sector, equivalent to what we're going to spend on healthcare spending each year. In other words, one way or another, the $3.8 trillion in national healthcare spending that we had for 2019, one way or another, it's eventually coming out of our private sector pockets. Nobody else is covering that for us. We're covering it. The insurance industry isn't covering it. The government isn't covering it. We're covering the expenditures, one way or another, out of our own pocket. Jayapal argues that reducing costs to international norms is one way for Medicare for All to pay for itself. Quote, you cannot legitimately say that you're going to fix the healthcare crisis we have if you don't bring down the costs, unquote, she says. By driving down costs through global budgeting, also negotiating prescription drug prices, busting up healthcare monopolies, and other measures, you end up with significantly lower financing needs. Cutting out such middlemen as for-profit insurers gets you part of the way there, but only part. You do not have to have a mechanism. You do have to have a mechanism, that's a quote, to directly address that for the future, unquote, Jayapal says. Jayapal's ideas for reducing costs were borne out recently by an analysis of the effects of H.R. 3. That's a modest bill that allows the government to negotiate prices on 25 high-cost drugs per year. Despite that small number, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that such negotiations would save the government $345 billion over a 10-year period. $345 billion for only 25 drugs. So Jayapal says, quote, imagine if it was 250 drugs, unquote. Jayapal says, quote, some members feel strongly about lifting the entire ban on the government actually negotiating drug prices, unquote. I want to add there that I've estimated from the beginning of my live streams on Medicare for All that I expected that we could save on pharmaceuticals not $345 billion over a 10-year period, but $400 billion, $450 billion, maybe even $600 billion every year. Every year. Trillions of dollars over a 10-year period. Going on. Moreover, it's hard to know if these kinds of savings will be fully accounted for in the budgeting process. Moving from curative to preventive care, for instance, could save trillions. And while the Affordable Care Act went partway on that, Jayapal's bill would go a lot further, particularly as those currently uninsured get regular treatments and thereby avoid more costly procedures. Medicare for All also eliminates the passed-on costs of uncompensated care. Currently, Warren is working with outside experts to craft funding for her own Medicare for All plan. Jayapal's and Warren's teams have discussed the funding issue with each other. I asked Jayapal if she thought it was worth it for Warren to counter the somewhat disingenuous debate around costs where it's only the supporters of Medicare for All who have to justify them. Quote, the way Warren talks about it in terms of overall costs instead of taxes is actually the right way to talk about it, unquote, Jayapal answers. Quote, I think some of this is also for her to be comfortable with how to respond on this, because this was Bernie's original bill that she sort of signed on to. She didn't sort of signed on to it. She co-sponsored it. She signed on to it. I think she has been less engaged on some of the details. If she wants to come up with 2 or 3 things that will give her that muscle to say, quote, I've looked at this and this is how I'm proposing to pay for it, unquote. What I hope is that it gets that question off the table because I think it's a red herring, unquote. Jayapal was dead on about that. The constant talk about financing crowds out the benefits of Medicare for All. Jayapal highlights the angle of personal freedom. Boy, she's so right about that. Quote, I have so many people who write to me with these unbelievable stories about how they have these dreams and they were lost because they have to work for a company that they totally don't believe in because they need the health care, unquote. She explains. And quote again, people who have gotten divorced because that's the only way to get care. I do think a part of this healthcare debate is about the freedom to dream and be, and we don't talk about that nearly enough, unquote. Jayapal is completely right again. It's about the freedom to dream and be. Bernie doesn't talk enough about that. He doesn't talk enough about the freedoms involved in Medicare for All. Ultimately, Jayapal finds the Democratic infighting over Medicare for All to be unnecessary and dangerous. Quote, we have to be united in the end on whatever comes out of this presidential debate. I've not said anything bad about the Affordable Care Act. We can't wait for the perfect system. We've got to do what we can to shore it up. However, to criticize a plan that is in-depth and thoughtful and actually addresses the very issues we need to address and has the support of an enormous number of Americans is a big mistake, unquote. It's a big mistake. And you know what? That mistake is not a mistake. It's being done for a reason. Actually, for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that the supporters of the Affordable Care Act don't want a Medicare for All bill because they got their donors. And the other reason, which is also very important, is they don't want to talk about how to fund these things because they don't want to commit to the higher taxes if such should become necessary. They don't want to be the butt of the Republican ads claiming that they are for higher taxes. And since the Affordable Care Act covers much less and spends much less, they can avoid talking about the realities of federal funding, which none of those other candidates, except for Bernie, and I think Jayapal also, I think she knows MMT too, but outside of Bernie, okay, and Jayapal, I don't think there's one of them that understands MMT or could explain how federal funding can occur through topping up the Treasury spending account in other ways than simply taxing and selling bonds. Jayapal says that one of her biggest fears is that a Democrat wins in 2020 and doesn't follow through on alleviating the healthcare crisis. Quote, she says, for 2024, if we don't have this addressed and Americans don't see substantial improvements in these broad structural issues, we're not going to win, unquote, she says. Quote again, that is what gave rise to Trump. I've said that Trump is both a symptom and a cause. Those entrenched interests that have stopped us from making these structural changes, like with the Affordable Care Act, have to be taken on, unquote. She's right about that. and she's right about 2024. But even more, if we don't pass Medicare for all in these first 2 years and end up with another crap variation on the Affordable Care Act, we're going to lose, or I should say, the Democrats are going to lose in 2022 and be swept out of office again. Because if they're swept into office this time, it won't only be because people want to get rid of Trump. It will also be because people want to have hope of getting Medicare for all and getting the climate emergency taken care of. And they're not going to accept these faux fiscal responsibility Democrats coming in again and killing all the progressive programs that are possible for Democrats, that may become possible for Democrats to legislate if their majorities are big enough in 2020. And of course, if we have the luck for Bernie Sanders, to get elected. So, going back to the presentation, perhaps, let me see that I am back. Yes, I am. Perhaps the most important reasons for Bernie to hold off, however, are that he will be in a much better position to get a better fix on likely costs because, one, if he becomes president, when he becomes president, he will have the resources of the Office of Management and Budget at his disposal. They'll be able to do modeling. They'll be able to provide better estimates. They can serve as a counter to the CBO. He can staff OMB with his own people. He can staff OMB with MMT economists. Two, likely costs and estimates will be affected by new budgeting rules and procedures in the Congress. Because when Bernie gets in, and if he has progressives in a more powerful position in Congress, they can change the budgeting rules and the procedures in the Congress. And three, he will be able to introduce new methods of filling the Treasury spending account into the discussion at that time, after he's president. And he has the bully pulpit. And he has teams of people to go out and help him to educate. He'll be in a much better position to introduce more and more people to the reality of federal financing. And watch how fast they pick up on it when a president believes in it. Watch how fast they pick up on it. And when the Secretary of Treasury is an MMT-friendly person, and when the chairperson of the National Economics Council is an MMT-friendly person, watch how fast a lot of people in the federal government then pick up on doing things in line with the kinds of policies that might arise out of a knowledge of MMT. More specifically, right now, pay-go rules play a big role in congressional budgeting, as I've said here in other live streams. These are not applied across the board, however, but most often are applied against domestic legislation sponsored by progressives in order to support a conservative bias when the legislation finally comes out, or, of course, a conservative bias in handling legislation so it actually gets blocked. However, Bernie is likely to advocate for changing legislative procedures to pass programs that are going to provide for federal spending first, and then to proceed with his tax legislation, which will, one, be structured to drain enough net financial assets out of the economy to prevent inflation, not solely through the taxes, but also through other measures to complement the taxes, and two, to accomplish other legitimate objectives of federal taxing, like reducing inequality, like discouraging behavior that's bad for society. If he's successful in working with Congress to reform its legislative procedures, then the issue of raising revenues for spending on Medicare for All will fade into the background, and we will be debating how much and what kind of taxing we need to have for containing inflation and other legitimate tax purposes, rather than debating how much taxing we need to reduce the deficit or to have a balanced budget or any such nonsense that has no real world relevance at all. More good reasons to hold off. Remember, the how you're going to pay for it question really reduces down to the how will you fill the Treasury spending account question. Right now, Bernie can't go beyond that to discuss alternative methods. That is, he can't go beyond easily the taxing and borrowing in order to discuss alternative methods of getting the Federal Reserve to fill the Treasury spending account so he can complete the government spending that's appropriated by Congress. But when he's president, he may be able to educate people about the virtues of, one, eliminating the debt ceiling for good, so we can always sell some debt instruments if we need to. Two, the virtues of using overt congressional financing, OCF. Or three, the virtues of using platinum coin seigniorage to get the necessary reserves from the Fed. Just to review, you create overt congressional financing by adding the following language to appropriations bills and other money bills that goes through the Congress. And the language is, upon passage of this appropriations bill, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account at the New York Fed with the addition to its reserve balance necessary to spend by this appropriation. And then a second sentence, in addition, the Federal Reserve is directed to fill the Treasury spending account with the additions to the Treasury reserve balances necessary to repay all outstanding debt instruments, including principal and interest, as they fall due for the fiscal year of by this appropriation. And more on the language, it's really page 2 up there rather than page 3, but okay. The first sentence provides the reserves necessary for the Treasury to spend its mandate from Congress without issuing new debt. And the second provides the reserves necessary for the Treasury to pay down the existing outstanding Treasury debt instruments as they fall due within the time period of the appropriation or the continuing resolution bill, okay, or other money bill that Congress is trying to pass. If this or similar language were included in every such bill, it would mean that, one, deficit spending by Congress would no longer involve issuing new debt instruments, so the debt would no longer grow, and two, that all outstanding debt instruments would be paid off as they fall due, as long as the Congress continues to include the new language in all its appropriations bills and continuing resolutions. I should have added a third result also to that, okay, and that result is that over a 30-year period, of course, all of the outstanding debt instruments would be paid off, because the longest term outstanding debt instrument right now in the federal government has a 30-year term. So, at the end of 30 years, there would be no more national debt. Nothing for the debt to terrorists to focus upon, insofar as the debt is concerned. Now, undoubtedly, they would turn to inflation and trying to scare people out of their wits with all the inflation they think is going to occur because of the deficit spending we're doing. Sooner or later, they contend there's going to be inflation. But fortunately, MMT economic policy also has considered inflation now pretty comprehensively, and the MMT economists believe that they have some very good tools for handling inflation. And one of the main goals of public purpose, according to MMT, is not only full employment, but price stability as well. So this is a markup sub-process here. It's just a simple figure. Congress passes an appropriations or other bill which mandates Treasury spending. The Fed, at that point, when the bill is passed, marks up the Treasury spending account, adding reserves sufficient to spend the appropriation and to repay debt instruments and the interest due during the period of which the appropriation covers. And then the Treasury spends the appropriation and repays the debts as they fall due. And those are the three steps, okay, in that particular flow chart. Okay, now, of course, there's also would be a corresponding flow chart, which would basically state, I haven't actually created that flow chart yet, but it would state that when taxes hit the Federal Reserve for settlement, then what the Fed would do is what it normally does now, which is to destroy the taxes in the process, of settlement. However, there would be no need any longer for the Fed to mark up the Treasury spending account further, because it would have already done so upon passage of the appropriations bill in the first place. So that's it. That's why Bernie is right when he says he doesn't have to talk about the details now. Of course, he doesn't have to talk about the final part of this, but he can talk very plausibly about the idea that the proper time to have the debate in terms of the exact details of that debate is after the election, and that the reason why that's justified is because he'll be in a much better position then to know exactly what the proper tax policies should be. But it's also perfectly clear, even right now, that since he's already identified $16 trillion, 1.6 trillion additional dollars per year of policy space that he has available to fund Medicare for all, that he has much more policy space each year than he needs, because there's no way that the costs for Medicare for all, even during the transition period, are going to run higher than $3.1 trillion per year. In other words, the federal government is immediately, during the transition period, going to start saving money on pharmaceuticals and going to start saving money on administrative costs. And that is likely to be considerable money. It won't be as much in savings as is going to eventually be the case. But I think we can look forward to seeing that $3.8 trillion we're now spending, discounting inflation, to shrink down to $3.1 trillion, even in the very first year of application of the bill. So, it's perfectly plain to me, and it should be plain to you, that Bernie has plenty of play there. He may not have to tax at all to pay for Medicare for all. He doesn't really know that yet. But even if he has to tax some, okay, in order to pay for it, he's got $1.6 trillion of funding options there. He doesn't have to turn to deficit spending. He can legislate taxes that will decrease inequality in our society and reduce the power of the 1% from the start, which we also need to do. He doesn't even have to resort to deficit spending then, before Medicare for all. Now, I think he may have to resort, okay, to Medicare, to deficit spending, to pay for the total amount of his program. Okay, but again, that is not going to be clear until he gets into office, until there are budgets produced for everything, for the whole thing. And then we can rationally come up with the amount of taxation that will be needed to drain funds out of the private sector to contain inflation and for other good policy purposes. But he's only a candidate for president right now. He can make the best judgments that he can make and the most honest judgments, okay, that he can make. But the fact is, he doesn't know the full reality of what he's going to encounter when he has all those resources behind him to find out what that full reality is. So it really is a little premature to ask him for every detail as to how he's going to do this. He's already given us enough detail for us to know that there's more than enough taxing potential to pass Medicare for all. He has answered the question of how we're going to pay for it already in terms of new taxes. He has answered it by saying there's $1.6 trillion per year of space for new taxes, fees, and premiums there already. And we know enough about the economies you can get through Medicare for all that we know even in the short run we're going to be saving enough. So there's no way he can exhaust that $1.6 trillion in policy space. In fact, the most likely thing to happen is that at the highest, he'll spend $600 billion per year more than the government is spending now. And that can be covered by the taxes. So that's it. I hope you liked the presentations. I'm going to check in with you now. I guess I must have somehow inadvertently turned that off, but anyway, that's fine. I'm going to check in with you now on Facebook, and I'm also going to change my view so you don't see reflections, so we don't see infinite reflections occurring here. Where am I? Here I am. Okay. Also, before I go to the discussion, please share, like, and subscribe, and please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Please, please, please do that for me. I really do need it to keep the lights on. And thank you very much to my current patrons for supporting me. You're very important to my efforts here. Okay, let me check in with you now. Did I leave that sitting there? No, I didn't. So I don't know why this view has not changed. It's been changed a long time ago. Very slow response here. I'm doing a refresh of the page now, so please bear with me. I shall be back in a second, or 2 or 3 or 4. Okay, sorry to be away. Things seem to be a little more difficult tonight. I seem to be coming in now to have things back. Hopefully everybody's still here. There we go. I think I'm fully back now. This would be a good meme. Which would be a good meme? Which would be a good meme? Yes, it was Scott Pelley, Susan. It was Scott Pelley. Can we get access to these slides after the live stream? Yes, you can get access to the slides. I'll figure out how to do that. I might just send you the slides as an email attachment. That might be the simplest way to do it. I'm surprised that John Harwood mentioned MMT. Let's see where I am here. Atlanta says, at this point, I am over Tulsi. Yeah, I'm afraid I am too. Dale says, looks swell. Thank you, Dale. Sharon Anthony Connor says, this came out this morning claiming that Dems are going to charge a 42% tax to pay for Medicare for all. Please read it. That's nonsense. I will read it. Thank you. I will certainly read it, but that is surely nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Steve Gonzo joined, and Nancy Trzynski joined. Hi, Nancy, and welcome. And Wade Bickel joined. And Gary Hout joined. Hi. And my daughter Devora has joined. And Dale Weaver's joined. Barney's joined. Lana says at this point I'm over Tulsi. And Meltemi X Subversive has joined. Hi, Meltemi X. Susan Eldridge has joined. And Kathy Langan has joined. Hi, Kathy. Susan Eldridge says, does Jayapal know MMT? I think she knows of MMT, and I don't know how well she knows it, but I think she knows some of it. I'm almost certain Stephanie's talked to her at some point. I'm not sure where I have that memory from, but I'd be so surprised if Stephanie had not had a conversation with her. Susan said, are these slides you created? Yeah, they are slides I created, of course. Steve Glanzo said they might align with their mandate, Article 1, Section 8. You mean Congress? Yeah, I think it does align with Congress's constitutional responsibilities. I think it does. It's Congress that's supposed to be the one creating the money, right? Right now, they're delegating it to the Fed and the Treasury. Teresa Santa says they're going to have to hire a lot of people. Not only are there a lot of virtually empty departs, but will have to replace a lot of corporate appointees from the past, won't he? Oh, a lot of people. Also, Bernie will have a mandate since the majority of these people want Medicare for all. Susan says, can we get access to these slides after the live stream? Yes. Send me an email, and one way or another I'll provide the slides, and if it's easier to provide them some other way by putting them up on the web, I'll do that too. Susan says, how much do you think we would need to be taxed as an offset? I don't know. It all depends upon how much we exceed the amount that we're being taxed, okay, present. Okay, but I've said, I think in the first year of the transition, it'll probably cost $3.1 trillion. That's my, off the top of my head, estimate. Okay, because if we were down to 2/3, then we'd be at the 2.5 trillion that we're spending and that we're taxing as an offset right now. So we'd probably need to tax another 600 billion annually, but that wouldn't last for 10 years. In other words, in the Bernie bill, something like that might last for 4 years, but it's going to be constantly going down. In other words, it'd be 600B the first year, maybe 400B the second year, maybe 200B the third year, and then the fourth year we'd get the full savings. Susan says, I'm surprised that John Harwood case mentioned MMT. No, that was Scott Pelley. It wasn't John Harwood. But John Harwood has talked to Stephanie in the past and has interviewed her. So he does have some knowledge, of MMT he's gotten from her. And he's also read articles, in the New York Times about MMT, which have appeared from time to time. He definitely knows that MMT is there. Now, how well he knows it, I don't know. I hope Bernie has an MMT town hall when he was elected. He'll have nothing to lose at that point, gain everything to gain. Well, he can send Stephanie out to do town halls all across the country on MMT. There's no better teacher. She is a crystal clear teacher, of MMT. And she inspires confidence. The first time I heard Stephanie speak was when she came to a conference that I had the idea for and helped to organize on fiscal sustainability on April 28th of 2010. And she was giving a talk on the hierarchy of money, okay, at that point. And boy, her clarity and her presentation just really stood out. And she was on the stage at that time, okay, with Bill Mitchell. In other words, they were at the same conference. Okay, there was Bill Mitchell, okay, and also Warren Mosler and Randy Pavlina, okay, and Marshall Auerbach. They were all there. And Stephanie's presentation was the clearest. It was simply the clearest. It was just stunning. Okay, Lana and Kathy Langen and 3 other people joined or rejoined, as the case may be. I think there was some rejoining involved. I also got some new comments, which would kick in. Steve Gonzo says, "Your forehead would be a good meme." Yeah, I'm sorry about that. You know, uh, I got a good monitor now, and the type is larger, but I still tend to squint. Maybe I should make use of my new eyesight. Maybe that would be better. Nope. I've actually now been changed to somewhat farsighted. And Susan says, "I like the way Warren Mosler explains MMT too." Yes, I mean, I do too. Warren was very clear, okay, on that day, and very casual, and very calm, and great at answering questions. They were all great, okay, at answering questions. And they were all very clear presenters, okay, including Bill. But uh, Stephanie was just outstanding. The part that you would add about telling the Fed and Treasury to fund whatever blue strips. Huh, I'm sorry, what's this about blue strips? I don't understand. Okay, maybe you can clarify that, Teresa. Sharon Anthony kind of says, but no one ever mentions Bill Mitchell. I mention Bill Mitchell very frequently. Okay, I think that Bill is, oh, Bill is just fantastic. He's just fantastic. Okay, when I have a problem and I don't properly understand it and I have to go figure it out, where I go first is Bill Mitchell's blog. I haven't bought the comprehensive textbook yet. I'm frankly waiting for it to come out. Okay, it's an ebook. I definitely don't want to have to read through a printed text, especially not a heavy one at this point. I'm enjoying ebooks too much. Steve Gonzo has joined. Okay. Any more questions or comments? Thank you for sharing. However, I could use a few more shares if you could manage them. That would be great. Sharon says, "I sent a link to one of his articles to people I'm explaining MMT to. I also send Warren Mosler, okay, and Ellis Winningham." Well, Sharon Anthony Connors, perhaps you can send some of my articles too. They're up. Quite a few of them are up, okay, at New Economic Perspectives. I blogged over there for a few years, and I must have, I don't know how many blog posts okay, I have up there. And I like to think that some of them are pretty clear about MMT. But anyway, your choice okay, of Warren, okay, and Ellis, certainly very good choices. They are very clear explainers. They both are very clear explainers, and among my favorites. Okay. Any further comments or questions? If not, I hope you enjoyed the presentation tonight. Don't forget to read the article I posted earlier. We'll look for some of yours too, and we'll bookmark. Thank you, Sharon. Okay. I won't forget to read the article. In fact, I am going to get it. In fact, I'm going to get it right now before I forget, so that I don't forget. There it is. Who knows? If it's particularly egregious, I might even cover it in my next live stream, Sharon. Okay, so thanks to everybody for coming again. I'm going to call it a night. And I'll see you today is Thursday, right? So I will see you on Saturday. No, I'll be here tomorrow, right? Because I was off on Wednesday. So, okay, I will be live streaming tomorrow night, okay, at 9 p.m. to make up for Wednesday. So I'll see you then. Good night, Susan. Have a very good night, and thanks for coming.